Okay, thank you to everyone for braving it through to this time of day. I'll try not to go on too long so we can all retire. Really the main focus of this, a lot of the modelling work that's been done for FMD historically has been in epidemic settings. And I want to really think about how we might translate some of the knowledge that we've got into endemic settings. The risks are very different. We can't necessarily port a model from an epidemic setting straight across to an endemic setting. So I just want to give you an example, and I'm going to say at the start, this is very much preliminary work. I'm really interested in talking to people about how we might evolve this model, so please come and talk to me afterwards if you have some ideas about this. Now, at the risk of causing a mass exodus in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to start off with the model. It's not going to be in too much detail, but I just want to give a little bit of background for the Warwick Model. So this was originally developed in the UK 2001 foot and mouth outbreak. And broadly, just to talk about this pictorially, if we have an infectious and a susceptible farm, we consider the risk of infection in terms of how infectious your infectious farm is, how susceptible your susceptible farm is, and then some kind of risk factor, which for an epidemic setting, distance is one of the main risk factors for transmission. So broadly, the closer the farm is, the higher the risk. It's common sense. I'm not going to talk about this at all. That's an equation. If you're interested in the maths, come and talk to me. I'm not going to break down all the terms. But what I really want to think about is this final component, which is the distance kernel, which essentially weights the probability of infection based upon this distance. And this is sort of our classical way that we would model in an epidemic setting. So broadly, the kernel will look something like this. So based upon how far the virus has travelled, we have an estimate of risk over distance. And if we put this into sort of 3 dimensions, so you have your infected farm in the middle and you get this sort of cone shape. So again, you've got a higher risk of infection the closer you are. And this is a classical way that we would think about disease-free settings. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about endemic settings. And what we want to think about is how should we model endemic FMD? And in this case, there are other risk factors that we need to think about. Distance is not purely the one risk factor we need to think about for transmission. So I was really fortunate back in November last year, I believe, to engage in one of the EuFMD training workshops. So they organised a series of workshops in Kenya and also in Nepal, and whereby veterinarians from around the world are trained to sort of go out, look at clinical signs of FMD and carry out outbreak investigations. I don't know what that's doing. So these are just some pictures of my experience. There's our little biosecurity zone as we were coming off the bus. That was a cow that we had on our investigation with FMD. And just to prove it, there's a picture of me in my biosecurity gear doing an outbreak investigation. Those of you that know me will know that is an extremely unlikely thing to happen. Yeah, modelers do sometimes get their hands dirty. But as part of this, as well as carrying out outbreak investigations, part of the process was to design surveys where we would go out, interview farmers on their farming practices, and look at their exposure to FMD and uptake of vaccination. And what we're going to do in this work is we utilise this series of surveys to assess risk factors and effectiveness of vaccination across Nakuru County in Kenya. So, now, hence this is the problem, because we only have data for any of these transect studies that carried out. So if we look at this, anything that's in grey here are data that were collected as part of these transect studies. And of course, there's huge areas of the county that I have no information about whatsoever. So what we've done is we've imputed the remainder of the farms in the county using the gridded livestock map of the world, which some of you may know, this was published by Tim Robinson and colleagues in 2014. So we can artificially populate the rest of the county with these imputed farms. Now, I will say this, I said this is preliminary work. Based upon this, this gives us a population of around 20,000 farms in the county. Having talked to our colleagues at EuFMD, we believe this is an underestimate. So this is something we need to look at. And what we're going to do, having got this population database, is use the information from the transect studies to look at farm-to-farm risk. So, what we did was we asked a series of questions to the farmers when we go out interviewing them. So they may be things like, Do you use common drinking sources for your livestock? Do you use common grazing land? Do you share equipment with other farms? Is milk collected from your farm? And then there were various questions that we asked that came under sort of the broad category of, in the last 6 months, did X happen? So, for instance, had you moved animals on or off your farm? Has a vet visited your farm? Or have you vaccinated your animals for FMD? And with all of these are the risk factors, but we're really looking for a final outcome, which is, have you had FMD in the last 6 months? So based upon these risk factors, we can identify, hopefully, risk. Now, of course, I'm sure some of you will say, well, there are a couple of these that are probably highly correlated with whether they've had FMD in the last 6 months. And I'm sure that's certainly true. And what we can do is we can then use these data to look at the relative risk of transmission across these different risk factors. So, I'm skating over lots of technical detail, but again, come and talk to me afterwards. What we've done is we constructed a decision tree to look at relative risks of each of these attributes upon transmission. And we can get something like this. So from this broad evidence, it suggests that, so anything with a higher weighting, according to our data, has got higher risk of infection. So it appears, based upon this preliminary analysis, any shared grazing land represents a highest risk, and there's a significantly lower risk to if you sell milk. So we will take all of these risk factors and essentially extend our transmission model to look at the potential for contact if you use these various different potential transmission sources. So, putting all this together, now I'm hoping this is going to work. So this, now the colours don't appear, unfortunately, at the bottom. Now, does the outbreak appear? Is someone on the laptop at the back that they can start the simulation? Does it not work? Technology problems with movies at this conference. So what you should see is an outbreak that's spreading out in waves of infection. And unfortunately, it's not going to appear, but this is not the main result I want to show, so it's not too bad. If you're interested, come and see me and I'll show you on my laptop later. And we see a series of infected farms spreading out in waves, vaccinated farms coming in, and farms that have natural immunity for a length of time that then become susceptible again. You'll just have to pretend it's there. But what I really want to look at is, can I reduce transmission by altering behaviour upon infection? So if we assume that upon infection, all farmers behave exactly as they would if they were uninfected, then we can get an estimate of the number of farms that would be infected at the endemic level. But if we impose, for instance, if we turn off each risk factor, we can look at the influence of that upon transmission. So if we say, if you're infected, you can't share equipment anymore, we can get an estimate of how much the infection would drop. And we can do the same thing for stopping using shared water or shared grazing land, or various different types of transmission. Now, of course, there are some here that seem to work well, but of course, practically, we can't say you can't have any humans coming on and off your farm if you have infection. So whilst these might work really well, of course, they're not practical in the field. However, even sort of restricting farms that are infected to not using shared grazing land, for instance. Someone can talk to me about whether that's practical or not, and I'd be really interested to hear that. We can get about a 10% reduction in the endemic level, which is interesting. But what about vaccination? And this is the final thing we looked at. So we want to investigate the impact of vaccination upon this endemic level of infection. So I say this is very preliminary work, so we've made some simple assumptions to start with, that when a farm is infected, we're going to look to infect other farms within, vaccinate, sorry, not infect. We're going to look to vaccinate farms within a 3-kilometre ring of infected premises. We know that coverage is not 100%. We're not sure what it is, and we're going to, at the moment, assume 25% of farms within that ring will comply, and we're assuming some capacity. And what we can do, and we're assuming a vaccine efficacy. We've talked about this a lot, but we know that the vaccines are not necessarily the highest efficacy. So we're going to assume a 50% to start with. So what we can do is we can simulate our model. Now, this section here is an artifact of the model that as we run it, we have to get it to settle down to an endemic state. So ignore anything that's here. What we're interested in is this endemic level infection as we persist. So if we run it with a 25% coverage, and then I switch to 100% coverage, so all farms within a ring are vaccinating, we actually don't really see any effect. which we were really surprised about to start with. And then what we realised was that a lot of the infections were concentrated locally. We were getting a lot of rings overlapping each other. And so we believed that actually we were getting higher coverage than we thought we were, which is why this doesn't work so well. And then if we look at increasing our capacity, so here we look at switching from 40 farms a day to 80 farms per day. Initially, we seem to do quite well, that we reduce the level of infection, but then we get this very odd bounce back effect. Now, having looked at this, we believe this is some impact of waning immunity. We're not getting enough reduction, and then when farms start to become susceptible again, we're getting it bouncing back, which was quite unusual. Finally, we looked at changing to a higher efficacy vaccine. And hopefully this is music to the ears of some, that when we started to switch the efficacy, even keeping a 25% coverage in a fairly low capacity, we got quite a significant reduction in the endemic level. And hopefully if we continue this, we could get this persisting on a much lower level than we'd seen before. So this was really promising. So we concluded that it was really important to have these high efficacy vaccines. Okay, so just to summarise, hopefully that was brief enough. The main thing to take here is don't take an epidemic model and port it over to an endemic setting without considering risk factors. It's really, really important. These transect studies, we believe, can provide a really rich sort of data for investigating these risks. And the model that we've developed suggests, and I'm saying suggests because it's very much a preliminary work, that reducing these shared resources can reduce transmission risk. And these high efficacy vaccines, if we can use them effectively, could significantly reduce the levels of infection in these settings. Now, I've said this multiple times, but I think I can't say it enough. This is preliminary work, and I'm really, really welcome comments about this. So just to conclude, a huge thanks Muskoka Nick Lyons, who's provided huge intellectual input to this, helped us with the transect studies, and was very, very informative when I was in Kenya back in November. Also, Keith and Nadia for helping set up the programme and allowing me to attend the workshop. A lot of intellectual input from Jonathan, from Eunice, and from Abraham. And finally, all the participants of NTC 27, all of whom are veterinarians and didn't take the mickey out of me too much for being a modeller. And finally, the student team who basically did all the work. Okay, thank you very much.